Micah 7. My goal when I started was to finish up and do the whole chapter, but that's not going to happen tonight. It's a little bit too much, and a lot of really very, very applicable things as we go through here. If you remember, Micah 5 was pretty intense. Micah 5 is some deep stuff. It takes a lot of study, a lot of, even to read over it, you think, man, you have to read it, you have to study it to keep it in there, because a lot of symbolism. Micah 6, a little bit easier to comprehend, not quite so deep. Micah 7 is very, very applicable, and you'll see what I mean as we go. But real quick, let's review Micah 6. It's a little bit similar to a courtroom. You remember this? In which God is talking. God is the one who's laying accusation. It's as though he calls Israel and Judah and he puts them on the stand and he's talking and he's laying accusation to them. They've been unfaithful. They've continually turned on God. They've continually gone after idols. And when confronted with their sin, you remember what they did in verse 6 and 7? Take a look at it and just remind yourself. They say, wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? What are they talking about? Sacrifice.
How much do we have to give?
Specifically, they're kind of going overboard. Right? So should we give thousands of rams? Should we give 10,000s of rivers of oil? Should we give our firstborns? They're kind of being sarcastic a little bit. They're being kind of mouthy when God is laying these accusations against them. Well, God's not looking for a grand sacrificial gesture, which is what they're talking about. Should we do this, Lord? And God says what he expects of them. What would truly please him is found in Micah 6:8. He hath showed thee, O man, what is good. What doth the Lord require of thee? But to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with thy God. God wants justice, God wants compassion, and God wants humility. Those three things would fix an awful lot of problems in Micah's day. Truth be told, those three things would fix an awful lot of problems in our day as well. And we'll see that even tonight. But Israel continues in her sin, and God details the punishment that's going to come to them here in chapter 6. But this evening we come to Micah 7. And I mentioned when we started this survey of this book of Micah, that he lived in days similar to our own, eerily so at times. And I think tonight, even as we're reading the verses, you'll see, boy, this is just all about what we're looking at too. Micah got through his circumstances because of his dependence on a big God. Micah was fully dependent on the fact that the Lord God, the living God, is in control of these things. And it should be comforting to us that the same God still sits on the throne, and he stands waiting to guide us through the times in which we live. But as we'll see tonight for Micah and for us, things can get worse, and things likely will get worse before they get better. We start off in verse 1 with Micah's lament. Okay? He starts off and he says, "Woe is me." Whenever you read the word woe in the Bible, it's more than trying to get the horse to stop. It's more than being melodramatic. This is the height of passionate grief. Woe is me is what he's pulling out the trump card of sadness. He says, "Woe is me, for I am as when they have gathered the summer fruits, as the great gleanings of the vintage. There's no cluster to eat. My soul desired the first ripe fruit." Now, in verse 1, Micah is using a literary tool. He is personifying Israel. Okay? When he says I, he's speaking as Israel. So he personifies it, and then he personalizes it. So it would be the equivalent of me saying, "Woe is me," speaking for America. That's what Micah's doing. He personalizes it, so it's as if the nations of Judah and Israel are talking, and he's talking for them. So it's personified and it's personalized. That's important that we understand that, because that's going to come back a couple times in this chapter. In verse 1, he speaks as if he were Israel, likens the nation to a vineyard or an orchard. But what's the problem with the vineyard or the orchard?
Nothing there.
There's nothing there. Why? Is it because it didn't grow?
Sounds like it.
It's because they already picked it all. So he says, yeah, I'm like the great gleanings of the vineyard. There's no cluster to eat. They have gathered the summer fruit. So it's not that they planted the crop and had crop failure. It's that the crop was planted, the crop came to maturity, and then the crop was gleaned. So that's what Micah's speaking at. He says, look, this is how it is in Israel and Judah. This is what it's like. He says that it's like being harvested and leaving nothing. And he goes on and he explains a little bit more in verse 2. He's going to say what is absent. So he's saying in verse 1, Israel and Judah are empty. Verse 2, here's what they're empty of. The good man is perished out of the earth. There is none upright among men. They all lie in wait for blood. They hunt every man his brother with a net. Micah looks at his country and he says, where are the good men? Okay, again, take this and apply it to where we're at. You ever do that? You ever watch the news? You say, what happened to all the men? What happened to the good people that there used to be? That's what Micah's asking. Where are the men? He's looking for good and faithful and godly men, but all that remain are violent, bloodthirsty, and treacherous ones. They're all for sale. They're all just, they're all wishy-washy. There's no men who are going to be here, who are going to be the solid backbone that our country needs. He looks and he laments their absence. And again, sometimes we watch the news or we get online and we ask ourselves the question, what happened to all the honest people? I mean, and I'm not talking about Christian people necessarily. Do you remember a day and an age in which it just seemed like people were a little more honest than they are today? Micah's saying, where are those people? He goes on and he's going to further describe. So there are no good men. The men who are here, they all lie wait for blood. They hunt every man his brother with a net. He's going to go on. He keeps describing them in verse 3. That they may do evil with both hands earnestly. What do you say when you're working? Have you ever been working and you're trying to do something, but you're holding something else and you're trying to work? You're trying to do a two-handed job with one hand. You ever done that? And it's frustrating. So you set what it's down so that you can get involved, so that you can really make a difference. That's how they're doing evil. Okay? They're putting things aside so they can get both hands dirty in wickedness. That's what he says. That they may do evil with both hands earnestly. The prince asketh. The prince would be someone who's in government, right? So someone who's, let's call them the legislative body. The prince is the one who kind of makes the laws, right? The prince asketh, and the judge asketh for a reward. Okay, so we have the legislative body, or individual in this case, and they're approaching the justice system. And the legislators are asking the justice system for a favor. Can you imagine this happening? It's happening all over the place, right? The legislation is asking the justice system for favors. Look who else is involved. And the great man. Okay, so we've got three classes of people here. We have the rich and powerful. We have the legislators, the prince, the people, the governors, the high up. and we have the justice system or the judge. They're all involved, and they're all doing pay to play. They're all scratching each other's backs and making it work out. They're all bribing one another. There's all kinds of corruption on all levels. And that's what's going on. The great man, he uttereth his mischievous desires, so they wrap it up. Now that almost doesn't sound like biblical language, does it? So they wrap it up. What does that mean? It means they all set out together to do crooked business, and what do they accomplish? Crooked business. They're good at it. They get involved with both hands. They're asking favors. They're giving bribes. There's all of this dishonesty. Again, does any of this sound familiar? Should. Verse 4. The best of them is as a briar. Is that a compliment? No. The best of them is as a briar. What does that make the worst of them as? Well, we don't even know. But if the best is a briar, the worst is really bad. The most upright is sharper than a thorn hedge. The day of thy watchman and thy visitation cometh. Now shall be their perplexity. So not only are the corrupt people corrupt, the good people are corrupt too. Everybody's corrupt. And Micah, can you kind of feel his pain a little bit? When he looks, he says, boy, even the ones who you think the best of them, they're crooked too. They're bad. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. It says, the day of thy watchman and thy visitation cometh. This is the role that God's prophets often found themselves in. The role of a watchman. Someone who can speak out. The prophets of God are rarely winning popularity contests because their words are not what people want to hear. In Ezekiel chapter 33, another one of the Old Testament prophets, Ezekiel chapter 33 verse 7 says, So thou, O son of man, I have set thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore thou shalt hear the word at thy mouth and warn them from me. This is God talking to Ezekiel. He says, look, I'm setting you up so that you can hear what's coming and you can warn the people what's coming. Verse 8 of Ezekiel 33. When I say unto the wicked, O wicked man, thou shalt surely die. If thou dost not speak to warn the wicked from his way, that wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thine hand. Nevertheless, if thou warn the wicked of his way to turn from it, if he do not turn from his way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. So, from Ezekiel 33, watchmen are usually not going to be popular. Okay? They're not even always, or even, depending on the time, they're not even, most of the time, they won't even be listened to. Because they're speaking a message that nobody wants to hear. But God says, look, it's your responsibility to tell them that death is sure. And if you tell them and they don't listen, that's one thing. But if I tell you to tell them and you don't tell them, then their blood's going to be on your head. So God has a purpose. And God has a purpose for Micah here. Again, prophets don't usually win popularity contests, but the faithful ones are honored by God for their faithfulness. The crowd might not want to hear what you have to say. Does the world want to hear this? No. But God says, you have a responsibility. You better share this. And when the world doesn't like it, and the world says, don't worry about it. When they die in their sins, that's on them. They had the opportunity and they rejected it. But if I let people go on their merry way, never knowing of Christ, never knowing of hell, never knowing of the penalty for their sin, and I just let them go, that's on me. Because they didn't know. I have a responsibility to share it with them. Micah is talking of this when he says there at the end of verse 4, now shall be their perplexity. Judgment's going to bring confusion. And boy, did it in the case of Micah. He talks about the relationships that suffer during judgment in verse 5. Micah said that confusion would be prevalent in the days of God's judgment, but now he goes on to explain the trouble that was coming for all of Israel's interpersonal relationships. Look at verse 5 here. He says, trust ye not in a friend. Put ye not confidence in a guide. Keep the doors of thy mouth from her that lieth in thy bosom. So, number one, don't trust your friends. In this time, this is not a biblical admonition to us sitting here. This is not, don't trust anybody, no, that's not what this is. This is, in the day of judgment, there won't be trust between friends. When it says, put ye not confidence in a guide, speaking of those who would guide, authority figures. Don't trust your friends. Don't trust the authorities. And then when it says, even the trust that is between spouses is broken. There at the end of verse 5. Keep the doors of thy mouth from her that lieth in thy bosom. Speaking of the wife. Verse 6. He goes on. He's talking about the turmoil of relationships. For the son dishonoreth the father. The daughter riseth up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. Families are going to have all sorts of strife in the midst of them. Now, again, does any of this sound familiar? This turmoil. Yes, ma'am?
Is that in the New Testament too, where it talks about?
We just went over that in Luke, when Jesus is talking about how he's come to bring division. He didn't come to bring peace, he came to bring the division that the gospel carries. And it mentions the son against the father and the father against the, so that's a New Testament principle as well. Now, when we look at these things, and we look at chapter 7 thus far, maybe we don't have these things to the extent that Micah experienced in the times of God's judgment, but we're seeing all of these things today. In some degree or another. We're seeing corruption on every level. We're seeing a loss of honesty. We're seeing trust broken in relationships. We're seeing familial strife at an all-time high, at least in America. I'm not speaking worldwide, but in our culture, this is going on. So what does Micah do? By application, what should we do? Well, look at verse 7. All of this is going wrong. Therefore, I will look unto the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Boy, aren't you glad? When the world's falling apart and all the institutions in which men trust are crumbling, look to the Lord. Micah's not got his eyes on the king. Micah doesn't have his eyes on the families that he thought, well, nothing will ever shake that family. Micah's not looking at any of that. Micah is looking to the Lord. This sounds a lot like Psalm 121, verse 1. It says, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord that made heaven and earth. When everything's going wrong, as it invariably will, when a culture turns its back on God, things are going to go wrong. When you say, when you turn your back on even common decency, things are going to go wrong. And in this case, Micah is living in a day and an age in which everything's going wrong. The world is crumbling, and he says, I'll look to the Lord. Every other source of help and confidence will fail, given long enough. You say, oh, well, so-and-so will never let me down. So-and-so will let you down. Even they may have the best intentions, but men are at their best men, and they will let you down in some form or fashion. They won't always come through for you, but God will. Now remember in verse 1 how I said that Micah was personifying and he was personalizing? He said he's speaking as though he is Israel and Judah. Well, he keeps doing that here. He's still identifying himself. Only in verse 8, he's identifying himself more with the remnant of Israel. We know. Look at verse 8. He says, Rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. When I fall, I shall arise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord shall be a light unto me. So, can all of Israel say this? Verse 8. Look at verse 8. Can all of Israel say this? Why not?
They don't have the faithfulness that they need to
Because
conquer the enemy.
a lot of Israel is not worshiping the Lord, are they? Who's a lot of Israel worshiping? Pick a god, right? Any god that they happen to find, one of the gods of the Canaanites, Baal, Ashtaroth, one of those were pretty popular. Now, speaking prophetically, Israel's enemies have and will rejoice during times of her trouble, but God will retain a remnant for himself who can say this. When it looks darkest and the most hopeless, the light of God's promises shine brightest. When I sit in darkness, the Lord shall be a light to me. Micah, again, he's speaking as though he is the nation. He's speaking for the remnant at this point. Take a look at verse 9. We see again imminent judgment. I, again, personified, personalized, I will bear the indignation of the Lord, because I have sinned against him. Until he plead my cause and execute judgment for me, he will bring me forth to the light, and I shall behold his righteousness. In spite of the fact that Micah knows the end, he has a good understanding that the road to get there is not going to be an easy one. When you read verse 8, you think, oh, so it's going to be okay, right? And when you read verse 9, you still get the idea it's going to be okay, but you also see, boy, there's some bumpy road between us and where it's okay. Israel and Judah would face the judgment of God for their sins, but God would also be judging the nations that he used to punish his people. Assyria is going to take over Israel. And then 100 and some years later, Babylon's going to come and they're going to take over Judah. But where is the Assyrian Empire today? They are not. Where is the Babylonian Empire today? It also is not. Saddam Hussein tried to resurrect it at one point, but that didn't work out real well. Okay? There is none. God uses nations to judge his people, but God is judging his people, and he's also going to judge these nations. That's what the whole book of Habakkuk is about. Habakkuk is saying, Lord, really? You're going to use them? They're terrible. And God says, Habakkuk, you're terrible too. Speaking of his nation, you've done an awful lot of wrong, and I'll get them too. And that's what God is saying here as well. The idea that God's going to use the nations, evil nations. Babylon was horrible. Assyria was horrible. That's why Noah didn't want to go to Nineveh, because he didn't want them to trust in Jehovah. He didn't want them to turn to the Lord. but God says, look, I've got their number too. I'm going to judge them as well. While verse 9 acknowledges the justice of God's punishment, it also expresses confidence in his mercy. I will bear the indignation of the Lord because I've sinned against him. Is God's judgment just?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I will bear his indignation because I've sinned. I've got it coming until he plead my cause and execute judgment for me. He will bring me forth to the light, and I shall behold his righteousness. There's light at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel still exists. You're still going to go through some really dark times. Verse 10. Then she, he's personifying again, then she that is mine enemy shall see it, and shame shall cover her, which said unto me, Where is the Lord thy God? Mine eyes shall behold her. Now she shall be trodden down as the mire of the streets. Just as Micah personified and identified himself with his nation, he now personifies and identifies their enemies with an unnamed woman. Here in verse 10, that's what he's doing. He's saying I, when he's talking about Israel and Judah. He's saying she, when he's talking about, well, we know Assyria and Babylon. The nation that God used to chastise his chosen are going to look down and make fun of Judah and Israel. They're going to say, Where is the Lord thy God? You depended in Jehovah. How'd that work out for you? But God's got their number too. God's going to come down on them. God's going to bring that nation low as well. It says, shame shall cover her. Now shall she be trodden down as the mire of the streets. Now, rather than go long and try to knock out the whole of this chapter, we'll stop here this evening. Verses 11 and 12, or 11 through 20, speak of the future blessing awaiting Israel. So read ahead and get that next bit in your mind. But from verses 1 through 10, I get the feeling, maybe you do too, as you read through this, I get the feeling that Micah loves his nation and his people. Do you get that feeling? I get the feeling that Micah was a patriotic person. That's how we would describe that. Somebody who loves their nation. He knows it's not perfect. He knows it's got all kinds of issues. But you get the idea that Micah's kind of rooting for his people. Do you get that feeling? So that's okay. Again, because of all the parallels, it's okay. I look at America, and we've got all kinds of problems, don't we? But I still love my country. I still think we live in the greatest nation on the face of God's earth. But we got all kinds of issues. I'm praying that God will do a work in our country. Micah's current surrounding circumstances didn't seem to warrant much hope. And I look at the news, and I look at the articles that I read and the things that I hear, and I think, how do we get back? Can you come back from where we are? Micah's current surrounding circumstances didn't seem to warrant much hope. Dishonesty, bribery, crooked dealings, perverted judgment, loss of trust on every level, even discovering that the good ones are bad. We've all been there. Every one of those, we could all give personal testimony and say, yep, I've been there. I've had that happen. I know what he's talking about. But Micah's focus wasn't there. Okay, remember verse 7? Micah's not looking at everybody doing wrong. What's Micah looking at? Looking at the Lord. He says, the Lord's still on the throne. The Lord's still there. Now, lest we be guilty of bad Bible interpretation. Okay? It is bad Bible interpretation to take the promises that God gave Israel and apply them all to America. That is not good Bible interpretation. That's not what I'm doing. America did not replace Israel as God's chosen people. Israel is still God's chosen people, and they still live. God still has a plan and a purpose for Israel. God's will for Israel is that they be saved. Okay? But by principle, by precept, there's nothing wrong with us understanding this is what God has done for a nation that looks like this. Okay? We live in a nation that looks like this. Now, we don't have the covenant promises as a nation that Israel did and that Judah does. Okay? But we do have this God is still on the throne. And I do have the promise. As his child, I do have the promise that God will sustain me, that God will sustain you. We have God's promise that the gates of hell won't prevail against the church. Okay? So there are promises that we can take, even that weren't to Israel, but as a child of God, I can look at the world, I can get caught up in the news. You know what it's like. If you look at what's going on in our nation today, it's easy to get discouraged, isn't it? It's easy to think there's no coming back from this. The only way out is up, and that's the Lord calling us home. But that being understood, we do have God's promises to us. If you're looking to man or to man-made institutions for your hope and you're placing your confidence in them, you are in for a terrible surprise. Okay? And maybe you're sitting here, and I know who I'm talking to. If you know some who are placing their confidence in man and man-made institutions, talk to them. Because the road's going to get real rough here soon. Okay? If all of your confidence is in what the government can do for you, if all of your confidence is what your party can do for you, if all of your confidence is what the leaders of the world are doing. Things are not good. But as I was studying here in Micah 7, I was reminded of Lamentations. In Lamentations, Jeremiah was facing the actual times that Micah prophesied. Micah's prophecy relating to the fall of Judah. Jeremiah lived it. Micah didn't. So Jeremiah is living when Micah was talking about. And in Lamentations 3:22, we read, "It is of the Lord's mercies that we're not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They're new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul. Therefore will I hope in him." There's your hope. Not this way, this way. "Therefore will I hope in him." Verse 25, "The Lord is good unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. It is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord." And Jeremiah lived in the midst of his nation going into captivity. So when we look around, make sure you look up. Okay? Or else you will find yourself in a very dark place. Like Micah could have, but Micah didn't. Micah looked up. He said, I'm looking at the Lord, because looking at the princes and the judges and the powerful men, boy, that's discouraging. I'm going to just look at the Lord. So take it from Micah. Take it from somebody who knows. Look to the Lord, not to the world around you, because the world around you is a mess, and it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. So look to the Lord. Any thoughts that you have tonight? Maybe a question, perhaps, from Micah 7, 1 through 10. I hope it has been both understandable, and I hope it's been an encouragement to you. I enjoy, from time to time, as I've said, going through the minor prophets and the major prophets from time to time, and just refreshing, because we don't go there often. On Sunday mornings, it's not often that I have people turn to Habakkuk. One reason is because it would be an awful lot of you're trying to find. It's just a short little book. But I want us to have a good understanding of what the book of Micah is. A lot of good truth. And I hope you see an awful lot of parallels to where we live today.